Welcome back to Taiwan Outlook. Joining us today is Gary Schmitt. Gary, we've been talking about the role of China in those cases, such as Iran and North Korea. Do you think that China is a responsible stakeholder, a term used by some government officials?
Yeah, well, Undersecretary Zellick, or former Undersecretary Zellick, made a famous speech about a year and a half ago about China having to become a responsible stakeholder. And on the whole, I think if you looked at that speech, there's a lot of things that Zellick said were positive about China's behavior, comparison with perhaps 20 years ago. But most of those were marginal. And then what Mr. Zellick did was laid out a whole series of other issues where we would like to see progress on China's behavior. And those were really quite serious and deep. And I would say that on the whole, China still hasn't become a responsible stakeholder. I mean, we should expect more from China. For example, President Hu just went to Sudan.
That's right.
And everybody said, well, behind the doors, he was very sort of pressing the Sudanese to sort of be more open to, a solution in Darfur. But the truth is, it was a very marginal effort. The message that the Sudanese probably took away from it was, yeah, they want to sort of send the signal that they've said something, but they're not really going to press us. And so, on the whole, when you think about places like Sudan, or the Security Council votes with Iran, or their failure to really press North Korea on the nuclear program, I would say on the whole, the record isn't very good.
Yeah, the issue of the rise of China has been widely discussed. And as we can see that in recent years, China has been very aggressive in some other areas which traditionally are U.S. sphere of interest, including Central America, South America, and Africa, and so on. How do you read China's diplomatic presence in those areas?
Well, I think it's a classic case of a rising power. We know about rising powers. There's a history of rising powers and how they behave. And they typically look for those areas in which the status quo power or the great power that exists, in this case the United States, are weak, and they move into those areas to try to take advantage of that. Their behavior isn't surprising. The question is whether it becomes dangerous.
That's right.
And that's just an open question. The history of rising powers isn't a good one. I mean, even the United States, when it was a rising power, had a period of military expansion and imperialism. Now, it didn't last long, mostly because we were a democratic country. So we got out of that business pretty quickly. But the key thing is that when you're not a democratic country, I think your behavior is just much more difficult to predict. And so the problem the Chinese face as a rising power is that they can say they want a peaceful rise, but if we don't know how they're making their decisions, if we don't really understand why they're doing what they're doing, the countries in the region and around the world are going to begin to sort of say, we have to hedge against that, which then in turn means the Chinese get very upset because we're hedging against them. So I'm somewhat pessimistic about China's rise unless China becomes much more open.
You just mentioned the so-called hedging strategy against China. And there have been some confusions about the real meaning of hedging. Could you explain that for us?
Well, I think it's not easy to explain because we have multiple policies towards China. We have a policy of engagement, particularly on that economic front. We have policies of worrying about sort of human rights. We have engagement policy with them, diplomacy, trying to get them to do the right things on other countries. And then we have a hedging strategy, which basically is a reaction to the military buildup that's been going on in China for more than a decade and a half. It's quite substantial and quite impressive. And again, precisely because we don't know what their military really thinks. We don't know what President Hu really thinks about Taiwan or other issues. We've begun to put in place military capability to try to deter them if something were to happen. And that includes trying to increase the number of bases in the region that we can have, closer ties to Japan on the military front, closer ties to Australia, closer ties between Australia and Japan, U.S. reaching out to India, Vietnam, Singapore, and it includes, frankly, better military-to-military relations with Taiwan.
Some people argue that the so-called hedging strategy is a different way to express the so-called containment strategy. Do you think that is true?
No, because to really do containment, you would really have to be much more serious diplomatically, and you would have to have much more use your economic interactions as a lever We're so far away from containment in the old traditional sense of what we did with the Soviet Union. I think hedging basically is a military strategy, and that's about it.
What's the role of Japan in the U.S. grand strategy in East Asia?
Well, I think it's evolving. For a very, very long time, the U.S. has seen its various allies in the region as allies to it. What I think is really kind of changing, and a very important trend line, is that now the democracies of Asia are beginning to talk to each other in a way they haven't before. So you now have relations and talks between Australia, Japan, and the United States that are routine. And so what you're beginning to get is a Japan that is not only closer to the U.S. in terms of military cooperation because of China, because of North Korea, but you're beginning to see a new Japan thinking about its relationship with its other democratic neighbors. And I think that includes closer, friendlier ties to Taiwan, frankly. So it's not, as we used to say, it's not your grandmother's Japan anymore. It's a different Japan.
Yeah, but as we know that there have been concerns about coming conflicts between Japan and China, and maybe the U.S. will be eventually dragged into the conflicts or unwanted conflicts between these two countries. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, it's always a possibility. I mean, one of the lessons of history is, I was in Japan in spring of last year, and the relationship between Japan and China was as low as it's ever been.
That's right.
The irony was that the very time I was there in Tokyo and then I went to Beijing, the figures were announced on trade relations. Trade had never been greater between China and Japan. But history tells us that most of the great wars in the past 2 centuries have actually been between countries that are trading partners. So having economic ties between two countries doesn't guarantee that you're not going to have conflict. And so it was a really quite striking example. You could have very, very good economic ties on the one hand, but have very bad political ties. And I think, and this is just my sense of when I was discussions in Tokyo and then Beijing, I think China's expectation about Japan was that it was going to continue to decline. And I think they were quite surprised that Koizumi actually sort of resurrected Japan. And for some reason or other, the Chinese just don't like the idea of having Japan as a sort of another co-equal in the region.
That's right. But how do you see these kind of possible sources for the conflicts between Japan and China? Energy and other things? Yeah,
I think those things are actually workable. But there's when people just talk about countries, they tend to talk about different interests. And if it was all that, I think basically wouldn't have much conflict, because interests allow you to sort of, for example, if there's a dispute about sort of who owns, what part of what ocean, ultimately you can negotiate that. You can sort of say, okay, we'll divide it. And the real problem is when you have countries that have ambitions, and those aren't easily satisfied with negotiations. And so the real question is whether China's rise will increase its ambitions, or whether its interest in sort of continue to rise peacefully will overtake those ambitions. And I think it's just an open question of whether China's ambitions or its interests are going to take precedent.
Yeah, with Prime Minister Abe replacing Koizumi as the new leader of Japan, do you think any possible changes in the course of U.S. foreign policy and security strategy?
I think they'll be increased. I think Minister Abe has made perfectly clear that he wants to sort of have close relations with the U.S. And he very definitely, before he did that, went to China. And so that protected him as not being, somebody who's just completely irresponsible. So, but at the end of the day, I think he thinks closer ties not only to the United States, but to the whole region is part of his agenda. Yeah,
but some people argue that Koizumi and Mr. Bush are perfect partners, you know. The reason why you have strengthening of ties between the two countries is because of these two leaders. But with new leaders of Abe and the lambda President Bush, do you think there could be some changes in the bilateral relationship?
Well, the truth is, yeah, personalities do matter. I mean, I think President Bush and Prime Minister Koizumi obviously got along quite well, and Prime Minister Abe is not the same, sort of, personality. And he comes from a very old, prominent Japanese family, and he just doesn't have the same kind of style. On the other hand, personalities aside, the underlying realities are that both the United States and Japan are worried about a rising military power in China, a power that's more ambitious than something we have to worry about. So that reality is going to drive the relationship as much as personalities.
Yeah. You said earlier that the reason why countries have concerns about China's rising power is because China is not a democratic country. What do you think about the possibilities of China going down the road of democratization?
Well, it's very interesting. 10 years ago in the United States, when people were talking about China, the overwhelming view was both on conservative and liberal side of the United States was economic progress in China would lead to political reform.
That's right.
It's quite striking in the U.S. that optimism has kind of disappeared. There are not nearly the same number of people who think that's the case. And in fact, there's a number of scholars and new books in the United States that talked about the sort of stalled reform process, that in fact, precisely because China is doing so well economically, it has allowed the Communist Party to maintain control.
Yeah.
So the irony is the more money they make, the more they're able to distribute the goods in a way that keeps political reform tapped down.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. In the United States, at least, I would say there's more pessimism about China's possibility of reforming.
Almost a month ago, China launched missile and shut down one of its satellites. How do you read that?
Well, I read it very much as, again, this question of China takes great pride in its new power. There was no military reason for it to be able to do that, unless it has aggressive, things in mind. The timing was terrible. Sometimes rising powers just do things because they want to say, "Hey,
I'm big."
Well, I'm big,
Yeah.
And that's the signal I think they sent. This is not unusual. I mean, I was looking recently at some history of the rise of Bismarck's Germany, Wilhelmine Germany. And they would bounce around from sort of trying to sort of tell the British, no, don't worry about us, to sort of being so frustrated they wanted to sort of show that they were, the new power, that they would then do things. And so that you would have this kind of vacillation. And I think the same phenomenon is going on in China.
Yeah, but it appears to be a confusing signal to the outsiders because, some people argue that before 2008, for the Olympic Games, China wants to maintain a very positive image internationally.
Yep.
But all of a sudden, they launch missile and shut down the satellite. How do you explain the timing of doing such an act?
Again, I think it's the psychology of rising power, which is that they're quite proud of the fact they've gained all this economic might and new military might, and it's just very hard for them to sort of not show it off. And also, I think the Olympics is a little misleading. The two most dangerous powers in the last century were Nazi Germany and Soviet Union. Before their own Olympics, both countries behaved in aggressive ways. So there's no history that the Olympics have actually sort of made people more peaceful, if just the opposite.
Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice advocated so-called transformational diplomacy. How is that applied to China?
Well, I don't think it's applied at all. So, it's just a very difficult problem. I mean, if a lot of countries are weak, and internally you're able to do things inside a country to help, civic groups, for example, like in Ukraine or Georgia and other places, you're able to, the U.S. government, along with its European allies and other countries, are able to help people that want to bring about democratic and political reforms. And also the United States has levers to be able to sort of use to sort of help that process along. China is just a big country, and their security apparatus is so strong that doing those kinds of things in China is just very difficult to do, if not impossible.
So we just have to live the way it is, and
well,
nothing we can do about it.
One of the problems with, for all the benefits of having China in the World Trade Organization, one of the downsides was that we gave up, not only the United States, but Europe and other countries in Asia, gave up any levers that it has over China's economics. We took that, WTO takes that off the board. You're not allowed to use economics for diplomatic and reasons of statecraft. So, the one great lever that we had, we gave up.
Yeah, that's right. As we know, the U.S. has been a very important balancer and stabilizer in the Taiwan Strait, which is very important for the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So when we come back, we'll talk about a triangular relationship among Taiwan, U.S., and China. Let's take a short break and stay with us.